Why don't we get started since it's already 5 minutes past the hour and the trickle seems to be slowing a little bit. So thank you everybody very much for joining us tonight. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Camille Mackler. I'm a senior visiting fellow on immigration at the Truman Center for National Policy. I'm here on behalf of the Truman Center for National Policy, which is a center that identifies, trains, and positions leaders across America who share a worldview oriented around diplomacy, defense, development, and democracy promotion. We're a sister organization of the Truman National Security Project, which identifies individuals who believe in the same and positions leaders around the world and around the country talking about those issues. And I'm so happy to be here and to be joined today for this first of a series of events we're launching on immigration with New York Assemblywoman Catalina Cruz. This is a personal privilege to be here today. Catalina and I, Assemblywoman Cruz and I, have been in this fight together, shoulder to shoulder, for nearly 10 years, not to age ourselves at all. But I know that there are many years ahead of us, and I'm so excited to be here and to have this conversation with you at this really critical time for our country and our immigrant communities. But before I do that, I just want to introduce you very quickly. And I'm sorry that I always forget the number of your district. You are the
39.
39. Did I get 72 out of that? The 39th district, one of our most diverse districts here in New York, right? Right in the middle of Queens. And before that, you were with the New York City Council. You worked for New York Governor Cuomo on many of his initiatives to protect immigrants. We've sent your bio around. We can share it again. It's extensive. The Immigration Committee for the New York City Council before that, the New York State Department of Labor. You started your career as a lawyer doing housing rights and defending individuals in housing court. And I can't wait for the rest of the country and our members and everybody else who's on this panel tonight to get to know you a little bit as we talk through. But I think just to start us off, I really want to ask you, to talk about why immigration is important to you, because I think that's the best way to introduce you to everyone, because that's,
First, thank you, Camille, for inviting me and for your years of really trusting the work that we've been trying to do together. It's been tough. It's been a long journey, and you're right, there's so much more work to still do. A lot of people think that because all of a sudden we don't have the former president in the White House anymore, that everything is rainbows and puppies, but there's still so much work to be done to undo not just the 4 years that he was in office, but it's been decades of immigration neglect, if you will, or actually, let me correct that, of purposeful immigration neglect. We've put in laws into place that that attacked and targeted our community, and then we purposefully neglected to change them, even though we knew that they needed to be changed. As Camille said, I represent the 39th Assembly District, which is the most diverse district in the country. It is also the district with the highest number of undocumented immigrants in New York. I used to be one of them. I grew up as a dreamer. I am the first one elected in the state legislature. I spent the first 13 years of my life in New York living without papers. My mom spent an extra 7 years after that until I was able to become a citizen and petition for her. Those days, those years taught me a lot about grit, but it also taught me about the injustices of our system, everything from the actual immigration system to the criminal justice system to the housing system to every single labor-related law and how it affects immigrants in a very different way. So for me, the root of it all is the inequality of the immigration system. The fact that if you can't afford a lawyer, you're basically screwed when you go into court. You can't really defend yourself. You can't really understand. I mean, there are many lawyers out there that practice something completely different because immigration is just so complicated and sometimes so heartbreaking. And so for me, this is personal. For me, it's not just about the fact that I grew up undocumented, that I experienced what it means to live this way, but it's the people that I represent every day. It's the folks that walk into my office. It's the people who were most affected, because that this piece we didn't mention. I also represent the epicenter of the epidemic in this country. And at one point, it was actually the epicenter of the epidemic in the world. Elmhurst and Jackson Heights were one of the neighborhoods most affected by COVID, but it was Corona that it was most neglected by COVID. It is where the undocumented members of our community lived. It is where the people who couldn't self-isolate, who didn't have preventative health care, who couldn't really come forward and claim the bodies of their family members, many of them in fear that they could be detained and deported. And so that is what drives me. That is what made me go into this field. That is what made me run, and that is what makes me keep on fighting to provide some semblance of equity and equality for my community. I'm just gonna take these off because they keep making noise against the microphones. So.
And in full confession, Catalina and I sort of came up with a bit of a script to organize the conversation tonight, and neither one of us have ever been able to stick to a script. So I'm going to go off starting now, because we were just actually moments before we started this webinar talking about the DREAM Act, and hearing you talk right now. I mean, the DREAM Act, reintroduced, right, by Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Dick Durbin last week, but maybe with an actual fighting chance for the first time in a very long time. Like, how
I think that's why I had to go get the wine.
Yeah.
You know, this piece is very personal for me. I remember being 17 years old and thinking life was going to be okay, that I was going to go to college, that I was going to be the next Olivia Benson, because we were also talking about Law and Order Special Victims Unit. I was obsessed with being her when I grew up. I went to a John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is the college here in New York that trains all law enforcement. And I wanted to be that. And I had those dreams, and I thought, oh, this is it. The DREAM Act is introduced. We have a chance. People recognize us for who we are. They're going to really give us the chance that we've been fighting for. And then another year came, and I'm like, this is it. This is the year. And another year, and another year, and another year. And we are here 20 years later. 20 years later. And it's so, and I remember this being right before my birthday. And I am about to be 38 years old. And it just got reintroduced almost around the same time. But this time it has a fighting chance. This time, kids like me are not going to have to think of emergency planning because their parents might get deported. They're not going to have to figure out how to pay for college if we do this right. If we do this right. But for me, I think the saddest part is that while so many of the young dreamers will have a chance to have their life put back together, there's still they're the original dreamers, mom and dad, and we have yet to have a real conversation about putting in place a path to citizenship for everyone. And so we keep fighting for the dreamers, and we keep fighting for their ability to fight for their country, because that's all they want to do. Just be in a country that recognizes their humanity, and basically the only country they've ever been able to call home. But we cannot forget about the original dreamers, which are their parents.
And you've already brought tears to my eyes. I should have also got the wine. This is going to be a great panel. But I'm as inspired as always by your passion and your dedication to your community that you're so close to. So, and on that topic, before we get to the federal, because I do want to ask you about how, what's happening federally and how states can impact it. But all politics is local, and there's always been this misconception that immigration is a federal issue and that only the federal government can handle it. And that's really not true. And we're both New Yorkers, so maybe we can start before we sort of take this, we're sort of start narrow and funnel it up to what, states across the country and then how, can do and how they can influence the federal government. But let's start at home, Catalina. So, when we started this, when we sort of got into this at the same time, where was New York and how have you seen that change? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, New York was in a place where we said we were immigrant friendly, but we did very little to prove it, very little to show it. Around the time you and I started working together, it's when we started to tackle immigration services fraud, where we really started to look at notarios. And I presume everyone watching knows, but just in case other people who are not immigration in the immigration world don't know, in Latin American countries, notarios, notaries have to be lawyers. While in the United States, all you have to do is take a test, you get a little stamp, and you go on about your way. In communities like mine, notaries were passing themselves off as lawyers, screwing up people's cases, and often leading to them having a removal hearing a removal case that many times ended in deportation. We also had a city that routinely would turn undocumented immigrants or immigrants with a prior conviction, who may have some sort of status, over to ICE. ICE had an actual office inside of Rikers Island, which is the jail where New Yorkers would go while they were awaiting their day in court, if it was a short stint or like an overnight. And so if you were an undocumented immigrant, if you were an immigrant with a deportation order, maybe you were documented and just had the order, you could not spend more than 24 hours in jail. And that was actually the rule of thumb for many petitioners. Your client has to be out within 24 hours, because if he's not, you are screwed. He or she will be put in detention, and we're off to a deportation proceeding from there. We also had our city agencies routinely sharing information with ICE. It's something that we were able to deal with. It's something that isn't happening at the city level, but it's still happening at the state level. But we also had more subtle forms of really discriminating against immigrants. Language access was not a thing. There was no executive order. We now have one at the state level and at the city level, where you are required as a state agency to provide translation. Whether it happens in practice is another thing. There's been several lawsuits against the NYPD, against our Department of Education, but things like that were happening. We were in a place where, I remember 20 years ago, it was such a taboo to even talk about being undocumented, because of that same fear that your teachers could find out, your doctor could find out, someone could find out, and you would be put in removal proceedings, and there you went. We also had much less access to legal services. There were very few networks, there were very few legal service organizations really dedicated to providing our community with the representation that they deserve. It wasn't until the Melissa Margarito days that we really had and for those of, again, who don't know, I always assume people are in the know, but this was our former speaker of our city council, who really put into place the funding and the structure to have some sort of network to represent not only the unaccompanied minors that were coming 5-7 years ago, but also the families who were facing deportation. And it was, in the way that it was stood out, it was almost like, if you live in New York, if your case is in New York City, and you are in a removal proceeding, child, adult, you would have an attorney, almost guaranteed. And we've had to fight for the funding every year, because a lot of things happen, but it's the biggest semblance of some sort of legal service network that we have, of right to counsel that we have in throughout the state. This one only covers New York City, but there's nothing like that anywhere else. I think those are the biggest hurdles, or the biggest indicators that New York was not a really progressive state when it came to working with and protecting immigrants.
And I think, just for context, because we do have people from all over the country and potentially who don't know immigration in as much detail, you're not entitled to, you don't have a guaranteed right to a lawyer when you're facing deportation, or as an immigrant. You don't have a lot of basic protections. You can be detained, imprisoned by ICE, by Immigration Customs Enforcement, for indefinitely sometimes. And New York has really been groundbreaking, particularly in legal access programs. I mean, when you and I started working together 8 or 9 years ago, New York City had about $4 million invested in immigration legal services. New York State had about $6 million, but it was really mainly for citizenship and some assistance for deferred action for childhood arrivals. And today, New York City has over $52 million invested in legal services, and New York State $16 million. So,
we're working on making it 25 this year.
Yeah, and New York introduced your bill, right? The first state-based right to counsel for immigrants facing deportation who can't afford a lawyer. So New York has really been groundbreaking there, but I think in other places too, beyond legal services. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of where what we've done there?
So I think I have to actually give us kudos because I do think that legal services is the biggest one. I have this saying that I want to be California when I grow up when it comes to immigration work, because I think California has done a fantastic job at leading the way. All of us have ways to improve how we really go about treating immigrants, but I think California is the model. I want New York to be as progressive and not just simply say that we are. One of the things that we are doing now and that I'm working with Senator Gustavo Rivera on is a bill that would basically protect our professional and skill-based licenses. Because we actually started thinking about this during the Trump administration, because we didn't know if he was going to, we were hoping he was going to lose, but we didn't know. And what would happen to all of those dreamers and the folks who had a professional license, if he got reelected and DACA really did go away. And that was kind of the impetus for that. The idea that we as a state may not be able to control immigration law, but we can control other things that still affect the lives of immigrants. So what this bill would do is ensure that if they not only do you have access to that professional skill-based license, but that you can keep it no matter who's president, no matter what the immigration law says, you can still keep what you've earned and what you fought for. And there is precedent because about, when was Caesar's case? Maybe 7 years ago, Cesar Vargas, who is the first undocumented a lawyer in the state of New York, he's now documented, thankfully, was able to get the court to make a decision that basically said, we as a state have the right to grant him that license because it has nothing to do with his ability to actually earn a living with it. It's just a license. And so we're doing that. We also have projects. I'll talk a little bit of more of the vision. Then I'll talk a little bit about what we have now. I also have another bill that's seeking to expand access to I have two bills actually to public benefit for undocumented New Yorkers. That one's with Senator Prasad, and the idea is that life saving, because right now during COVID, many of these benefits, whether it's certain housing benefits, whether it's certain food-based benefits, and I say food-based because it isn't just food stamps, it's also WIC and other things. Some of it is controlled by federal law, but some of it is not. And so wherever we have the ability to say, you live in New York, you don't have enough money to sustain yourself or your family, we'll give you access to these services. Another one I'm really proud of, actually, and I'm really glad to see that Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez was able to follow our lead. We introduced a bill last year that actually provided immigrants and increased the amount of money that any New Yorker would get to bury a loved one. Right now, the law says you get $900. That's what the law says. There's an executive order that the mayor passed that says that now brought it up to like $1,700, and I've yet to see the first funeral, a dignified funeral that could be done for that amount of money. And so one of my colleagues in the Senate and I, Senator Sepulveda, we introduced a bill that basically would increase the amount and open it up to undocumented immigrants, because so many people were dying, they couldn't afford it. And we were using mass. There was a point in New York's history where we were burying our loved ones in mass graves. And I'm not talking about 100 years ago, I'm talking about last 6 months. And so we opened up that access. We made sure that by introducing the bill, we pushed the mayor to change his regulations and to open that up. And sometimes that's all you have to do. You introduce the law so that somebody else can push the envelope the right way. I'm trying to think, what else did we do? Oh, and there's always money. There's always money that we're trying to invest in our communities. We're pushing to make sure that there is more money for ESOL programs so that people are more integrated into our community. We're pushing to make sure that, yes, we have legal services. I am actually working on a bill now. And so if any of my colleagues in the Senate are listening, I haven't yet figured out who my co-sponsor is going to be. But one of the things that we saw happening, not just during COVID, but even before that, is landlords taking advantage of the members of our community. And by the way, California has this bill, and saying, if you don't pay me, I'm going to call ICE. Similar to what employers would sometimes do. If you don't vacate this apartment so I could rent it to somebody else, we're going to call ICE. And so the city law, the city of New York has regulations that basically make it a penalty. You would have to pay a penalty if you found to have been harassing your tenant with a threat of ICE, but there's no state law that says that. And so I'm working on a bill that would make it a misdemeanor, and if it's egregious enough, a felony, and would fine you a couple of $100,000 if you dare threatened an immigrant with ICE in order to get them out of their home. And so, those are some of the things that we're working on. I think New York has really done a good job, could be doing better, but a good job of investing in our immigrant community. We created the Office of New Americans, which I think at the time was the first in the nation. We've been leading on our work to combat labor and sex trafficking. That while people think it only affects immigrants, it affects other people too. But it does affect our immigrant community, especially in the farming industry. We have a lot of labor trafficking happening, and so we've invested money, time, and in training in that, and I was very proud to have helped in that work when I was at the state level. We've also opened up access when the Trump administration took steps to attempt to end DACA. The governor actually put in an executive order that said these documented young people could keep their health care. And so that was key. The other thing that we've done, and may he rest in peace, is the Jose Peralta Dream Act. And I say may he rest in peace because it is unfortunate former Senator Peralta wasn't able to see the fruit of his labor. He passed away actually maybe about 6 months before we passed the bill. And what the bill did was not only in-state tuition, but actual financial aid to dreamers, and an ability to not have to choose between eating, sleeping, going to school, and having a future. And so we've done a lot of really good things, but there's so much more that we can still do.
Absolutely. And I just want to say quickly to those putting questions in the chat, where I am keeping an eye on them. I'll try to either weave them in or we'll get to them at the end, but please keep putting your questions in the chat. We will definitely get to them at some point before 7 p.m. tonight. And so you've talked a lot about a lot of the investments we've made, but I think also just a lot of protections that we've put in, right? I mean, you were talking about professional licenses. We do have other kinds of licenses. I would definitely not say that New York led the charge on that, but I don't know if you want to talk about that or the detainer laws or any of that.
Oh, the detainer law.
No, remember that? So 2013.
Oh man, those were the days. Those were the days. And it's actually a great conversation topic for today, because today was the launch of New York for All, which is a bill that, very similar to the detainer law, would halt the cooperation between state agencies and ICE for the purposes of deporting someone. And so I mentioned earlier that back in the early 2010s or so, the practice, and actually even before that, the practice was if someone was arrested and fingerprinted, and their name, and I'm using plain language, and their name was pinged by the system, ICE would be called. And so when someone would go from the precinct to the barracks, or the jail cell while they waited to see the lawyer, you couldn't actually stay there for more than 24 hours. Because if you were there for more than 24 hours, which was the amount of time that it was taking for the system to recognize this is an undocumented person, this person has an order of removal, you get picked up by ICE and you'd get placed in removal proceedings. And think about the fact that all of that happened before you were even found to be guilty or innocent of whatever the underlying crime or arrest was for. And so you never got your day in court, which in and of itself is a constitutional violation. You immediately got sent to ICE detention, and many people were deported before they even good people who may have made a mistake or may just have gotten caught by a silly mistake, never got their day in court to be able to defend themselves, and it was double punishment. It was double jeopardy, if you will. And so what the detainer law did was, one, It kicked ICE out of Rikers, which is the reason why it took them very short time, and in 24 hours they were able to pick up people, because they actually had a trailer truck right outside of the jail where they had an office. So they were kicked out of there, and then the law said you could only transfer someone from NYPD detention to ICE detention if you met certain requirements. It had to be a certain type of crime. It had to, which generally was the more egregious, the harsher felonies type crimes, and you had to have an order from a judge, which we knew was nearly impossible to get, because a judge in his right mind was not going to issue a detention order for someone who committed a civil oh my god, the word escaped me for a second.
Action.
A civil infraction. It just doesn't happen. And so we knew that in practice it would equate to nobody would be turned over to ICE, and in practice that's what has happened. On top of that, there was an executive order. I want to say that it was under Bloomberg, I can't remember right now if it eventually became law, but it was a non-cooperation agreement, basically, where city agencies would not turn information over to ICE unless it had to do with actual with actual federal requirements. We were just meaning someone who was applying for food stamps or someone who had to apply for a federal benefit. We were not sharing the information of people who came in contact with the city or with the federal government. It was just not happening. At the state level, that wasn't the case. We had many counties who are not immigrant friendly, if not outright xenophobic. We had many counties who purposely would use, and I know you remember this, would purposely use ICE officers as interpreters in their jail cells. So a sheriff would pick up somebody upstate, and it happens to be that right down the hall is somebody from it's ICE, and they'd use them as an interpreter. And so it was almost like, a big happy family, and our people were getting stuck in the middle of that and being deported. I'm sure many of you have seen the videos of people driving to church, driving to school, and in upstate New York, people were getting stopped and arrested because they had no driver's license. Up until last year, no one was able to actually apply for one. And so that was resulting in people living their life and attempting to earn a living, was resulting in them getting picked up and deported. And so what the proposal now, and it's Senator Julia Salazar and Assemblywoman Karina Reyes are proposing a law that would basically almost mirror what the city of New York has done at the state level. No cooperation with ICE except in certain instances. I mean, with the federal government, except in certain instances where you're required to do it for somebody to access a benefit. With a couple of more caveats, and no cooperation with ICE. Like, we're not going to help you deport our families. That's just not going to happen. So I'm supportive of the bill, and I'm hoping it becomes a law. I know it's going to be a little bit of a fight, because I think politically many people and many of our own colleagues and on the Democratic side are going to think that because we now have who we have as a president, it's all rainbows and puppies, and it's not.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to that. And we're getting some very specific questions in the chat and the Q&A that I want to get to. But before we do that, I'm wondering, so moving away from New York for a little bit, if you're not in New York, or you're not in California, or you're not even maybe in Illinois, or Maryland, where we have seen some, Oregon, I know I'm forgetting some, but just as examples, I think if you're a state that really hasn't started this process yet of wanting to support immigrant communities, but either you as a state legislator or maybe advocates wanting to convince state legislators, where do you think, I mean, it's a very broad question, but like, right, where do you start? And I think also it's important to remember that, we often think of New York as a very progressive state, and certainly our state, I mean, we have a super majority of Democrats now, both in the Assembly and the Senate, but there are parts of New York that are very, very red, and very not open to these kinds of policies. So I think there are lessons that can be learned from places like New York, but more broadly, like, where would you tell an advocate from a state that may be less, potentially inclined?
So I think that it's going to depend a lot on the issue that you're trying to advocate for. But two things that I've seen working. One is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are fantastic advocates who have been doing this for a very long time in other states. Reach out to them. talk to them, ask them to even come out to your state, maybe do a training. I mean, not now with COVID, and I guess with COVID, you could do it virtually. When I was working for the city council, one of the things that we did was we actually went out to Phoenix, Arizona, right after we passed our municipal ID law, and we implemented it and actually gave IDs to everyone, regardless of immigration status. Organizers from Phoenix, Arizona reached out to us. They were working on the One Phoenix ID, and they asked the speaker, myself, and several advocates. We actually went out there and we helped talk to other electeds, and we help kind of team up, and we help educate. And so you can find an organization that has done it and has done it well. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Reach out to them, learn from them, because I can guarantee you that they would be more than happy to kind of impart that knowledge. The other thing is team up with the unusual suspects. One of the things that I never expected during our fight for driver's licenses for all was how the business community actually stepped up and said, we think this is the right thing to do, and here's why. We had an entire press conference. We had many, many press conferences around the issue, but an entire press conference where it was different kinds of business owners, everything from what you would expect, like a landscaping company, to like a tech company. The realm of advocacy is there. I will also say, one of our biggest unknown weapons, if you will, was forward.us. It is a fantastic think tank that has a reach that is national, that has worked with all of those unusual suspects and the usual suspects, and understands what has worked and what hasn't. And they have the bandwidth and the money to help localities and communities really change the trajectory of how we treat immigrants.
And to that point, actually, Susanna has a question in the Q&A, and I promise we will get to all the questions. I'm just trying to sort of sift through them in order of relevance. Susanna says, thank you, Catalina. Is there a mechanism for sharing state legislation draft language to national immigration groups to see if it can inform the draft language we use in new federal bills? A good mechanism that you've used. I know Republicans share state bill language to their federal Senate legislative cousins for anti-immigration bills, and I'd love to see if we can do this for pro-immigration bills.
So I don't think there's some sort of mechanism per se, but I have seen certain entities do that. Forward is one of them. I generally send them any bill that has to do with immigration and ask for feedback. The National Association of Latino Elected Officials, NALEO, is a really good resource for that. And then there is, oh God, I think it's called the Association of State Legislators. I'm forgetting, but I would go through whoever the state legislator is that you're looking to have sponsor your bill, and have them share it. I think, I mean, I wish we were as clever as the Republicans are when they're trying to do evil. But starting with folks who have been at the forefront of this fight, I personally would start by going to somebody like forward.us.
And you also mentioned earlier, right, that you introduced that bill, which was heartbreakingly necessary even just 6 months ago, as you mentioned, to help with funeral costs. And I know a lot of our immigrant communities were trying to find, who are so hard hit, and continue to be, but it was devastating in March and April to see what was happening in your cities, to ship bodies back to their native countries for burial. So, and you're saying that was an example of something that was ultimately taken up by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez.
Not necessarily in that same realm. Ours was more to increase the amount and to help undocumented folks. I think hers was more to just increase the amount. $7,000 is basically what it costs right now to bury someone. Our bill came actually from heartbreaking conversations with city officials that were left to adjudicate some of these requests, saying we have so many undocumented people asking for help and we don't have the power to help them. It's in your hands. And I said, let's change the law.
Maybe something to work on for all of us. So before we get into the more specific issues that have been raised through the chat and through the Q&A, you mentioned earlier, and I just want to, I can't say this enough, right? I mean, everyone seems to think that we've solved the problem by electing a new administration. And I keep sort of trying to tell people, no, we stopped the bleeding for 4 years. And now we get into, whatever I haven't watched ER recently enough to remember what or I guess Grey's Anatomy would be a more modern analogy of what we need to do now to really go in and repair and rebuild and be strong. But I think that one thing that we have seen, certainly in New York, and I think other places like California, and some of the other states I mentioned earlier, is the ability of states to influence federal legislation or federal policy, right, to push back. To model what it needs to look like. So what do you sort of see as the next steps in that regard? Like, what should I mean, we've had a flurry of actions from the Biden administration undoing some of the biggest harms, right? Rescinding the Muslim ban, establishing a task force to reunite families separated at the border, stopping construction on the border wall, at least for now, and then a lot of announcements about reviewing what's been done and trying to figure out how to fix it. But where do we go from here, and what role do states play and localities play there?
Look, I think the most important thing we have to do is find not just a pathway to immigration, but completely overhaul our immigration system. Everything from what's on the books to how those books are interpreted. You know, the way that we train immigration judges, the way that we trained the lawyers who are opposing counsel, if you will, not to call them something else. That was not going to be a very nice word. And all of that needs to be overhauled before we even have a conversation about defunding anything. I think I frankly, and I've said this many times, people love that hashtag of defund ICE. Yeah, you take away the money from the agency, you still have the law. If you don't change that law, what good is defunding an agency? Because what government is really good at doing is putting that job onto yet another agency, and it's going to be another agency in charge of screwing with our communities. And so, you know, we can chew gum and walk at the same time. We can change the law, and we can take away the money from this particular agency to do its job the way that it does. And so if I could never hear that hashtag defund ICE the rest of my life until we actually change immigration law, I'd be happy. Because I think it's so amazing that people have that conversation when they don't understand that what they're going to do is what they did with INS. If you remember INS, what did they do? They just created 2 more agencies, and the laws actually became worse. And so what we at the state level can do is implement all those and push forward for all those laws that affect the rest of the life of an immigrant, that, and I can't say this enough, increase legal services access. Because while if we're truly going to change immigration law and give access to more people to become citizens, and defund an agency that is basically destroying lives, because again, we can chew gum and walk at the same time, people are going to need lawyers to get them through that entire system. And that's where the state can come in and really do a good job.
And as you know, in my other role, I'm the executive director of an organization that represents immigration legal services in New York. And I can say, speaking for myself, that I would be more than happy to put myself out of a job. I've got big plans to open a cafe in the south of France one day.
I remember once reading a tweet from an exhausted immigration attorney that their lifelong dream was to never have a job again, to never be needed again.
I mean, I'm sure, maybe not everyone feels that way, but I certainly feel that. In the chat, we have a question about what can we do at the state level to start, for example, by ending detention. And this is actually coming from somebody in California. And in New York, I believe that private detention facilities are illegal, that private detention contracts in New York are not allowed.
Yeah, but we routinely rent space to federal government to use our publicly funded jails. We routinely do that. And so we need to look at not doing that, first of all. We can't be the same state that says we protect immigrants, you can cooperate, but let me rent you a piece of my jail so you can hold them. That makes no sense to me. And so if we really want to deal with that detention issue, we have to stop cooperating fully. And I've heard rumors that some of my colleagues are working on bills like that, and I'd be happy to support it. If I don't see it actually happening, I may put one myself, because I think we can't be that level of hypocrite. It's just hypocritical of us to try to portray to be a progressive pro-immigrant state while allowing an agency that is destroying our families use our space to destroy our families?
There's a question in the Q&A about how did we manage, how have you all managed, I'm just including myself in there, to get the state to invest so much money, to get New York to invest so much money in immigration services. And a related question, I think in my mind, at least if I'm guessing accurately as to where your answer is going to go, is how valuable are accredited representatives in this push to get lawyers? And for those who aren't as familiar, the federal regulations do have a mechanism for the Department of Justice to accredit staff of nonprofit organizations to authorize them to provide legal services to immigrants for no or nominal fees, in an effort to increase access to counsel for immigrants. And so non-lawyers can provide legal services if they're accredited by the Department of Justice.
So I'll start with the last question first, actually. Believe it or not, there are places in our country where there are not enough lawyers. Believe it or not. If you look in areas in upstate New York,
New York is one of them.
New York
all the lawyers
is actually,
that we have.
New York is actually one of them. There are places where there's like one lawyer for 50 miles. I've heard, as we were working through our bill to really create a network of access to representation, I remember hearing stories from lawyers who had to travel 4 or 5 hours each way to meet with a client. There are places where there's just simply not enough lawyers for our immigrant community. And that is where these accredited reps are really truly key. Because if there's not an accredited rep and there's not a lawyer, people are going to resort to these paper fillers, llena papeles, or these notarios, and that is how they end up deported. So I find them to be almost like a physician's assistant for our profession. When there's not enough doctors, a physician's assistant can do just as good of a job. And then to the question about how do we get the state to invest, organizing, getting the right people to support the issue, and getting the right electeds in office. It is key. And so I actually won't use immigration as an example. I'll use the Child Victims Act in New York as an example. For 20 years, the Catholic Church stood against a law that would have actually held them accountable for their years of neglect and outright condoning of sexual abuse against many children. And so one man in one organization started a PAC, a political action committee, and started to organize and help get more Democrats elected. And the very next year, after 20 years, that bill was passed. It's something similar to what I think can happen in many states. You get the right you organize and you get the right electeds into office, you can see a turnaround. It's not a quick answer, but you can see a turnaround in who actually cares about the community. And in line with that has to be organizing to register people to vote. I remember the fight for driver's licenses. One of the biggest lines that I would use against my colleagues was, every single one of you has undocumented people in your community. And every single one of you has children of undocumented people in your community. And if you don't stand with us, those children will vote you out. And I have to tell you, at least in one case, that actually happened last year. There was one Democrat in the Senate who did not vote with the immigrant community, having been an immigrant herself, and the immigrant community actually organized and voted her out. So it's powerful, it's doable, but it's not an overnight answer.
I think also, if I could add to that, to I guess the answer to my own question, but I think also not being afraid of having the conversations. I mean, I know that you were talking about untraditional allies earlier, and I spent a lot of time, for example, doing trainings for the New York Sheriff's Association, and you can bet I was not they were sort of looking at me when I walked into their conference room thinking like, why was she even invited to talk to us about immigrant rights? And there's definitely a lot of like heckling at the beginning of the presentations, but as we move forward, it actually, there were ways to have conversations around access to justice, around just fairness and fair play. And
I mean, some of the sheriffs were the same people who stood with us in favor of driver's licenses for all.
Exactly, which is why I was kind of getting there. So I think also just not being afraid to have the conversations. and being, agreeing to respectfully disagree when it comes to it. We have a few questions in the chat and the Q&A about COVID related relief. How, immigrants have been left out of a lot of COVID relief packages, which actually makes, and you made this point very forcefully, if I remember a year or so ago, that makes legal services that much more important, because with legal services, you have better chances of obtaining relief, which means a work permit, which means the ability to, economically survive this crisis, in addition to everything else. But there's also some questions in the chat. I'm just going to group them together, about, the challenges to vaccine distribution to immigrant communities. I mean, in New York, we've seen, lack of translation, lack of the systems to get an appointment for anyone who's even eligible are all online, or phone lines that don't pick up, and other issues like that. And then, of course, there's just the fear of accessing public health benefits because of the Trump administration's changes to the public charge rules. And the last question that's related to it, I'll just sort of, like I said, group them all for you and you can answer it as you wish, is what will it take to move a state like New York towards making subsidized health insurance available for undocumented adults?
Okay, so excluded workers. I'd love to say that there was a good answer to this one. For many states, there's the economic aspect of what it costs to include these folks into our budget. Um, while at the same time, I think it's, am I allowed to curse on this thing? It's a bullshit argument. I can't even not hide that. These were the same folks that when, not me, because I actually ran a food pantry during the pandemic, but for the people that were able to stay home, it was these people who were picking your food, delivering your food, putting it in the restaurant or in the supermarket, then being there while you purchased it or delivering it to your house. These were all those same people. And now we want to turn around and say, after you've paid 10, 20, 15 years of taxes, we can't help you. That's disgusting. Like, there's no other way to describe that behavior. Inhumane, disgusting, unfair. It's horrible. Now, in New York, we have an excluded workers bill that would raise the taxes of the uber rich, because those guys got really rich during the pandemic. Many of them made a lot of money, and so they should be paying the taxes that go along with that. And that money can then be used to create a fund or actual money to help the workers who couldn't benefit from unemployment insurance, from food stamps, from any of the help that was available to every other person who pays taxes in our country, but simply has a piece of paper to prove that they are quote unquote worthy. No, they are worthy. And so while I wish I had a different answer, while I wish that our federal government could do more, I don't think that they will, because it's a politically touchy subject, because many of our essential workers who are undocumented are also seen as dispensable, like, in Spanish, los desechables. Like, it's the disgusting truth of our country. We're good enough until we're not. And so it's left up to the states. And I'd like to see New York have the courage to raise the taxes. The way that I framed it is raise the taxes on the rich to help the working poor survive. We're not asking for a handout. We're literally asking for you to help our community survive. Like, time and time again, I had people coming to my door. I remember one day after we closed our food pantry, someone came to our door and knocked and said, I thought she wanted food. And I said, we're out. She said, no, my husband died yesterday. I have no idea how I'm going to bury him because we're undocumented and I have no money. And so we were left to scramble and to try to help this woman not only figure out how she was going to bury her loved one, but how she was going to pay rent, how she was going to eat. Why should we have to do that after this woman and her husband were working and paid taxes for decades in our country? The second question around the vaccines, it's abysmal. I've done cussed out the mayor and the governor's team so many times I can't even count. I will say this: the governor's team has been very responsive every time. While I may not agree with him on everything, it is emergency management, it is crisis management, a crisis that none of us have ever had to experience before. And every single time I've raised the concern to them, they've turned around and they've helped us work through it. We called and we said that hotline doesn't have enough languages. They turned around and they fixed it. We called and we said we need Citi Field to have access to vaccines. They turned around and they fixed it. We called and we said we need to make sure that more people have access to our deemed essential workers so that they can fit within the 1B. They fixed it. You know, right now I'm advocating actually for farm workers to be included into that 1B section, because if there is a disruption in our farming industry, there is a disruption in how and who can get food, and we can't afford that. So that's our latest push. We're hoping that it'll be successful as we get more and more vaccines. Unfortunately, it's still a matter of who has a better advocate and who has the ear of the right people. I'm frankly overall appalled by how the vaccine distribution has happened, but you know, we are pushing or hoping that it'll get done the right way eventually, and that too many people won't suffer because of that. And then subsidized health. If we can pass healthcare for all, if we can pass the New York Healthcare Act, we don't have to worry about that piece, because it'll cover every single person. In the meantime, there are several bills. One of them is mine. Another one, I believe I believe Assemblymember Gottfried is actually the one carrying it, that would open up access to the Obamacare, I guess is what we call it, the healthcare market, to undocumented folks. But we need a special permission from the federal government in order to do that. Otherwise, it gets preempted. So we're waiting and we're hoping. And in the meantime, what we do in offices like mine is advocate for the funding not to be cut to hospitals like Elmhurst Hospital, that usually provides the healthcare services, preventative as well as emergency, for folks who don't have insurance. That includes undocumented people and documented people. And you know, right now the budget has a proposal of a cut of something like $25 million, which would devastate my hospital, the same hospital that was one of the first ones to see more than 10 people die in one day during the height of COVID. So we fight. And we keep fighting.
Well, those are inspiring words to end on, and we're basically at the hour. So I just want to thank you so much for doing this, Catalina. I hope everyone, you know, follows you on social media, signs up for newsletters, sort of sees really what it looks like when we have a real champion and advocate for our communities in a state house. And I know that you're only going to keep going higher and doing better and bigger things for our state. And I'm just so grateful to have you fighting for us in our state, but also to be able to call you a friend. So thank you.
Thank you, Camille. I did see a question. Someone wanted to know where did I immigrate from?
Oh yes, I was going to end on that. So, wait,
I immigrated from Colombia, weirdly enough, election day, 1992. Who knew?
And you beat me to this country by 2 years, but I was born a US citizen, but I grew up abroad and came in 1994. Thank you so much. And I want to say thank you to everyone. This is the beginning of a lot of more programming from the Truman Center and the Truman Project on immigration. Tomorrow we'll be announcing a panel on how gender-based violence, how refugee protections don't protect victims of gender-based violence for International Women's Day, a very cheerful topic, but a very important one.
Thank you so much, Camille, and thank you to the Truman team. You know, having spaces to have conversations like this, where everybody from around the country, I guess that's the positive of having things be digital, allows us to really share. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are other people who are willing to help you. If anyone who's watching us needs information, wants to chat, do reach out to me via social media. I'm one of those electives. I actually answer my own social media. So reach out. I'm happy to share information. You can find me at Catalina Cruz, just like my name, Catalina Cruz, and then NY on any of our social media platforms. It is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Follow us, support us, and let's go and change the world. I know that sounds like a puppies and kittens kind of dream, but I think we can do that. We can't leave it all to the federal government to get their act together. We as advocates, we as lawyers, we as local electeds can actually help change the lives of people every day.
I have nothing to add to that. That's a perfect ending. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Catalina.
Thank you, and thank you for the honor of being your friend.
It's right back to you. Bye.